Hello, my adventurer. It's Max, and tonight, I would like to share with you some of the most timeless stories ever told. Stories whispered in quiet voices for hundreds of years. Stories that begin in dark forests and end with light and comfort. So lay back, let your breathing slow down, and let the soft rhythm of these old fairy tales carry you gently into rest. This first story is about two children, Hansel and Gretel. Long ago, in a tiny cottage on the very edge of a vast and shadowy forest, there lived a poor woodcutter. He had very little money, and there were many days when the family had nothing at all to eat. The man lived with his wife and his two children. The boy was called Hansel, clever and brave. The girl was Gretel, kind, tender-hearted, though she was still very small. One evening, when the moonlight filtered through the cracks in their thin wooden shutters, and the children were already lying in their straw beds, the woodcutter sat with his wife near the dying fire. His wife spoke first, her voice sharp and cold. "There is nothing left to eat," she said, "not even a crust of bread. Tomorrow morning we must take the children deep into the forest and leave them there. Perhaps someone will find them. But we cannot keep them here. If we do not rid ourselves of them, we shall all starve." The poor man was horrified. "No, wife, I cannot do such a cruel thing. They are my own children," he whispered. But the woman pressed him again and again, her voice harsh as the winter wind. She told him they had no choice, and at last, weary and broken, the woodcutter agreed. Now Hansel, clever Hansel, had not been asleep. He had heard every word of the cruel plan. His little heart trembled, but he did not let Gretel know. When his parents were at last asleep, Hansel crept quietly out of bed, pulled on his thin jacket, and tiptoed to the door of the cottage. Here you may imagine the soft sound of bare feet across old wooden boards, the faint creak of the door as it opened to the night. Outside, the moon shone brightly in the clear sky. The stars looked down like gentle guardians, and on the ground before the cottage, the white pebbles glimmered in the silver light. Hansel bent low, his small fingers gathering pebble after pebble, each one cool and smooth to the touch. He filled his pockets until they could hold no more, and then he tiptoed back inside, to lie down beside his sister once more. At dawn, before the birds had begun to sing their morning songs, the stepmother woke the children. Her voice was harsh and left no room for questions. "Come, Hansel, come, Gretel," she said. "We are going into the forest to gather wood. Here is a piece of bread for each of you. Save it for your dinner." And so they set out. The father walked ahead with his axe. The mother followed, and the children trailed behind. Hansel often turned back to look at the little cottage until it was hidden from sight, and as he walked, every few steps, he let a small pebble fall from his pocket. Click, clack, they landed upon the forest floor, a silver trail of tiny stones, shining faintly in the morning light. Gretel noticed and asked softly, "Hansel, what are you doing? Why do you keep stopping?" And Hansel whispered, "Be still, little sister. Do not worry. Look at the moon tonight, and you will see." At last, they reached a place deep in the woods. The father built a fire, and the mother said kindly, though her eyes were sharp, "Sit here, children, rest by the fire. We will go deeper into the forest to cut wood. When we are finished, we will come back for you." But as the crackling fire warmed their small hands, the mother and father slipped away. And when the children looked around, they were alone. Still, Hansel did not fear. The moon rose high, and its light filtered through the trees. And when Gretel began to weep softly, Hansel pointed to the ground. There, glimmering in the pale moonlight, were the little pebbles, one after another, shining like drops of silver. The children followed the trail. All the way home, when they pushed open the cottage door, their father was overjoyed. He had been sorrowful, for he loved them dearly. But their stepmother grew angry. "Wicked children," she cried, "you will not escape me again." The next morning, she placed before them two even smaller pieces of bread. Her eyes were cold. "This is your dinner," she said. Again she led them into the dark forest. Deeper this time, much deeper. Hansel wished to scatter pebbles once more, but alas, he had not been able to gather any during the night. Instead, as they walked, he crumbled his little piece of bread, letting the crumbs fall upon the earth behind him, crumb by crumb, soft and small, until the bread was gone. Hello, if you are awake still. Imagine the tiny sound of crumbs falling on dry leaves, the quiet rhythm of a boy's hand letting go. Again they were left by a fire. Again their parents did not return. And when night fell, Hansel comforted Gretel. "Do not cry, little sister. We will find the way home. Just wait until the moon rises, and we will follow the trail of bread." But when the pale moonlight touched the ground, there was no trail to follow, for all the crumbs had been eaten by the birds of the forest, the owls and sparrows, the tiny blackbirds. They had pecked up every piece. Now the children were truly lost. They wandered all night, and then all the next day, without finding their way home. Their small legs grew weary. Their bellies ached with hunger, but still they held each other's hands. On the third morning, just as the sun rose gently over the treetops, they saw something strange through the branches. It was a little house, but not like any house they had ever seen. This house was made of bread. The roof was covered with cakes, and the windows were of clear sugar. Hansel's eyes grew wide. Gretel gasped softly. They ran to the house, and at once began to nibble. Hansel broke off a piece of roof, sweet and crisp. Gretel tasted a sugar pane, and her face lit up. And as they ate, a soft voice called from within, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who is nibbling at my house?" The children froze. They looked around, but saw no one. At last Hansel answered, "It is the wind, the gentle wind." And they continued to eat. But soon the door creaked open, and out came a woman. She was very old, leaning on a stick. Her back was bent. Her eyes were sharp and glimmering. "Oh, my dear children," she said sweetly, "come inside. You must be so tired, so hungry. There is no harm here." So they followed her in, and there inside the strange little house, she gave them warm milk, and soft pancakes, and apples as red as the sunset. The children ate until they were full, and then they were given small white beds to lie in. They were so tired that at once they closed their eyes and slept deeply. But this woman was not kind at all. She was a witch, and though she smiled softly, in her heart she planned to eat the children, for she had built her house of bread and sugar, only to lure them in. Hallo, breathe slowly now. The story will grow darker, but my voice will stay calm and gentle. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she seized Hansel. With her bony hands she dragged him to a little cage. and locked him inside. "Now, little one," she said to Grethel, "fetch water and cook for your brother. I will fatten him up, and when he is ready, he shall be my meal." Grethel wept bitterly, but there was no escape. She was forced to cook for Hansel. But clever Hansel, when the witch came to feel his finger, to see if he had grown fat, held out instead a little bone from the cage. The witch's eyes were dim, and she could not see. She felt the thin bone, and muttered angrily, "He is still too lean. I will wait." But at last she grew impatient. "Grethel," she snarled, "tomorrow I will eat your brother. Go now, fetch water, knead the dough." And so the day passed, and night came again. Hansel and Grethel lay awake, whispering softly through the bars of the cage. They did not know how they would escape, and the dark forest outside was still and silent. The night in the witch's house passed slowly, heavy with fear. Grethel lay awake on the hard floor, her small hands folded tightly against her chest. Her brother Hansel was locked in the cage, and she could hear him breathing softly, each sigh filled with worry. The witch had grown restless. For many days she had felt Hansel's finger, waiting for him to grow fat enough to eat, but Hansel had tricked her, holding out a little bone each time. The old woman's eyes were weak, and she had not noticed. She muttered angrily to herself, pacing back and forth, her stick tapping on the floorboards. At last she cried out, her voice sharp as broken glass, "Enough, whether he is fat or thin. Tomorrow I shall eat him." And turning to Grethel, she hissed, "Child, prepare the oven, make it hot, hotter than ever before, for in the morning I will feast." Grethel's lips trembled, but she nodded softly. She dared not show her fear. Instead she crept to Hansel's cage, knelt beside it, and whispered so faintly that only he could hear, "Oh dear brother, tomorrow she means to take you." Hansel pressed his thin face to the bars. His voice was quiet, but steady. "Do not cry, Grethel. Be brave, be clever. We will find a way. We must." Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and the night stretched on. Every sound seemed louder, the crack of the fire, the creak of the rafters, even the witch's soft snores when at last she slept. Morning came. The witch rose early. She built a fire beneath the oven, piling sticks, until the flames leaped and roared. The smell of burning wood filled the house. Smoke drifted through the chimney, curling like dark ribbons into the sky. She rubbed her hands together with greedy delight. At last she turned to Grethel. Her crooked finger pointed toward the wide oven door. "Crawl inside, child, and see if it is hot enough. The bread must bake well, and so must your brother." Grethel's heart beat hard in her chest, but she forced her face to look puzzled. "Innocent, I do not understand," she whispered. "How shall I go in? I do not know the way. Please, show me." The witch scowled. Her patience was thin. "Stupid girl," she muttered. "Do you think I must do everything myself? Look closely. I will show you." She bent low, her back creaking like an old branch. She laid her crooked stick aside. Then, muttering angrily, she pushed her head and shoulders into the dark mouth of the oven. The fire glowed deep inside, casting a red light upon the stone walls. In that instant, Grethel's fear melted into courage. With a sudden strength born of love for her brother, she seized the heavy iron door. Her small hands pulled with all their might. The hinges groaned, and then the door slammed shut. The witch gave a terrible cry. Her voice was high and sharp, like the shriek of a bird of prey. She pounded and thrashed, but the door held firm. Grethel pressed her back against it, holding it tight. Though her body shook, the screams grew weaker, fainter, until at last they were gone. The house was silent, silent but for the crackle of fire and the quick beating of Grethel's heart. She leaned against the door, her breath fast and shallow. At last she whispered softly to herself, "It is over. We are safe." Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of relief. She rushed to her brother's cage, her fingers fumbling at the latch. The iron was heavy, but at last it lifted. The door creaked open, and Hansel stepped out. He was pale and thin, yet alive. The children embraced. Clinging tightly to one another, they laughed and wept all at once, their joy spilling out after so many days of fear. "We are free, Hansel," Grethel whispered, and Hansel pressed his cheek to hers. "Yes, Grethel, free at last." For a time they sat together on the floor, too weak to move, but unwilling to let go of each other. The house around them was quiet now, strangely empty. And then, as the morning light streamed in through the small window, Hansel's eyes wandered across the room. He saw something glitter. In the corner stood a chest, small but heavy. Grethel and Hansel opened it together, and inside they found gold and jewels, coins and pearls, treasures beyond imagining. Their eyes grew wide. Never had they seen such riches. Hansel let the coins run through his fingers, their clinking sound soft and musical. Grethel held a necklace of shining stones, watching the colors sparkle in the sun. For a long moment they simply gazed at the treasure, their hearts filled with wonder. And then Grethel said softly, "We must take this home. Father will never be poor again." Hansel nodded. They filled their pockets until they bulged. They filled Grethel's apron with gems and coins, and though the load was heavy, their steps were light. They left the witch's house behind. The forest was still, as though it too had been waiting for the children's freedom. The trees whispered gently in the breeze. The sunlight filtered down in golden beams. Birds sang once more. Step by step, the children walked through the forest, though the path was long. They did not lose hope. Hansel held Grethel's hand, guiding her over roots and stones. Grethel laughed softly when he stumbled, and Hansel smiled when she pointed out a patch of berries for them to share. At last, after many days of wandering, they saw a clearing ahead. Their hearts leaped, for there stood their father's house. They ran forward, calling out. Their father rushed to meet them, his eyes wide with astonishment and joy. He embraced them both, holding them close as though he would never let go again. He wept as he spoke. "My dear children, my dear, dear children, I thought I had lost you forever." They told him all that had happened, and when he saw the treasure they carried, he could hardly believe his eyes. "We shall never want for anything again," he said softly. But then he added, with tears still falling, "I would give up every coin, every jewel, only to have you safe by my side." The children wept too, and in that moment, their little family was whole again. As for the stepmother, she was gone. Her hard and cruel heart had led her to an early grave, and so the father, Hansel, and Grethel lived together in peace. The gold and jewels ensured they were never poor again, but more precious than treasure was the love they now shared. And so the story of Hansel and Grethel comes to a close, not with fear, not with hunger, but with warmth, safety, and love. Here you may close your eyes. Let your breath slow and drift gently, for the danger has passed, and only peace remains. Far away, in another kingdom, there once lived a king and a queen. They were noble and kind, beloved by their people, and yet their hearts were heavy with sorrow. For though many years had passed, they had no child. Each morning the queen walked alone in the palace garden. She wandered among roses and lilies, her hands brushing against the soft petals, and every time she saw a child pass by the palace gates, she felt an ache in her heart. She longed for the laughter of her own child, the sound of small footsteps echoing in the halls. One day, while she bathed in a marble pool, a frog leaped from the water. Its voice was deep and strange, and it croaked softly, "Your wish shall soon be granted. Before a year has passed, a daughter shall be born to you." The queen listened, and though the words startled her, she felt hope stir within her heart. She shared the news with the king, and together they waited, and just as the frog foretold, within the year the queen gave birth to a daughter. She was the loveliest child in all the land. The king was filled with joy. He prepared a great feast to celebrate. From near and far, guests were invited. Among them were 12 wise women, called to bless the child with gifts. Each one carried a power, a gift of kindness, of beauty, of wisdom. But there was a 13th wise woman in the land. She had not been invited, for the king had only 12 golden plates, and no more. And so, when she learned of the feast, anger filled her heart. The day of celebration came. The hall was bright with candles, the tables heavy with food. Musicians played sweet songs, and the air was filled with laughter. One by one, the wise women stepped forward to bestow their blessings. The first gave beauty, the second gave kindness, the third gave grace, and so it continued, until 11 blessings had been given. Then, the doors of the hall burst open. The 13th wise woman appeared. Her robe was dark as midnight, her eyes sharp as glass. Without bowing, without greeting, she strode to the center of the hall. Her voice was cold. "So, I was not invited. Very well, I too shall give a gift." She raised her hand, and she spoke a curse. "In her 15th year, the king's daughter shall prick her finger on a spindle, and she shall fall down dead." The guests gasped. The queen held her child close, trembling with fear, but before anyone could speak, the 13th woman turned and vanished. Silence filled the hall. Then the 12th wise woman stepped forward. She had not yet given her gift. Though she could not undo the curse entirely, she could soften it. Her voice was gentle as she spoke. "The child shall not die. Instead, she shall fall into a deep sleep. 100 years shall pass, and then a prince shall come to wake her." The king tried to protect his daughter. He sent forth a decree that all spindles in the land should be destroyed. No spinning wheel was to remain, and for many years the child grew safely. She was called Briar Rose, for she was as fair as the rose, and as sweet as the dawn. The blessings of the wise women shone within her. She was beautiful beyond words, gentle and kind, loved by all who knew her. The years passed swiftly. The girl grew into a young maiden, graceful as a swan. But fate cannot be avoided, and on her 15th birthday, the curse awaited. That day, Briar Rose wandered through the palace halls. Her steps carried her upward, to a small tower she had never entered before. The door was old, the key rusty, but when she turned it, the lock gave way. Inside sat an old woman. She bent over a spindle, spinning flax with practiced hands. Briar Rose stepped closer, her eyes wide with wonder. "Good day, grandmother. What are you doing?" The old woman smiled. "I am spinning, child." "What is spinning?" asked Briar Rose. She reached out her hand to touch the strange object. The moment her finger brushed the spindle's sharp point, she pricked it. And at once, she sank to the floor. Her eyes closed softly. Her breath slowed. She fell into a deep, deep sleep. The curse had come to pass. At that very moment, all within the castle were touched by the same sleep. The king and queen, the lords and ladies, the servants and guards, even the horses in their stables, even the doves upon the roof. Each one grew still and silent. The palace itself seemed to slumber. Around the castle, a hedge of thorns began to grow. Year after year it thickened, until the walls were hidden behind a great forest of briars. The thorns were sharp and cruel, twining together so none could pass, and so the castle slept. Here we pause, letting the silence of the tale sink in, as though the whole world were holding its breath. Years turned into decades, and decades into 100 years. Stories spread through the land of a sleeping princess hidden in a castle of thorns. Brave princes came to find her, but the thorns were too thick, their barbs too cruel. Many tried, but none returned, until, at last, 100 years had passed, and with them, the time of the curse. 100 years had passed, and decades into 100 years. Stories spread through the land of a sleeping princess hidden in a castle of thorns. Brave princes came to find her, but the thorns were too thick, their barbs too cruel. Many tried, but none returned, until, at last, 100 years had passed, and with them, the time of the curse. 100 years had passed. There lies a maiden of surpassing beauty, a princess called Briar Rose. She sleeps within her castle, waiting to be awoken by a prince's kiss. One day, a young prince heard the tale. He was brave, and his heart was stirred. He longed to see the princess with his own eyes. He asked the elders of the land if the story was true. Some shook their heads. Others warned him. "Many have tried. None have returned. The briars are deadly. They ensnare and tear apart those who approach." But the prince only smiled. "I am not afraid. My fate is my own." So he mounted his horse and rode until the forest rose before him. The hedge of thorns loomed high, dark and twisted, their barbs gleaming like knives. Yet when the prince approached, a strange thing happened. The thorns softened, the cruel branches drew aside, opening into a gentle path. For the 100 years were ended, and the time of awakening had come. The prince dismounted and walked forward. His steps were soft upon the mossy earth. Birdsong was hushed. The air itself seemed to wait. He passed through the silent courtyard. There lay the guards, motionless as statues. There stood the horses, still as carved stone. Even the hounds at the gate slept with eyes closed, their chests rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. The prince moved deeper into the castle. The kitchen fires were cold, yet the cooks lay slumbering at their tables, spoons in hand. In the hall, nobles reclined in their chairs, heads bowed in sleep. Dust lay thick upon the floors. but still the air felt enchanted, timeless. At last the prince climbed the spiral staircase of the tower. His footsteps echoed softly in the stone chamber, and there, in a quiet room filled with light, he saw her, Briar Rose. She lay upon a bed of carved wood, her head resting gently upon her arm. Her face was peaceful, her lips slightly parted, her breath soft as a sigh. The years had not touched her. Her beauty was as radiant as the moment she had pricked her finger. The prince stood beside her, overcome with wonder. For a long time he gazed, hardly daring to move. And then, with a heart full of reverence, he bent down and kissed her. Here we pause, soft and slow, as though the whole world holds its breath. At once, her eyes fluttered open, blue as the morning sky. She looked at the prince, and in that moment, she knew him, as if she had been waiting all her life. She smiled. The spell was broken, and not only for her. Throughout the castle, life returned. The king and queen awoke upon their thrones. The nobles stirred in the hall. The guards blinked and stretched. The horses stamped their hooves. The hounds barked joyfully. The doves upon the roof took flight into the open sky. Everywhere, voices rose in astonishment and joy. The castle was alive again. Briar Rose rose from her bed. The prince offered his hand, and she took it. Together they descended the tower stairs. The king and queen embraced their daughter with tears of gladness. The people rejoiced. Soon after, the prince and Briar Rose were wed in great splendor. The halls of the castle rang with music and laughter, and though 100 years had passed, it was as if no time at all had touched her. Here we rest for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the joy of the ending fill the silence like warm sunlight. And so ends the story of little Briar Rose, the maiden who slept for 100 years and awoke to love. There was once a miller who had a very beautiful daughter. She was quiet and gentle, and her presence filled the home with warmth. The miller loved her dearly, but he also wished to see her well married, for he was not a wealthy man. One day, a wealthy suitor came to ask for her hand. He was handsome enough, well-spoken, and he carried himself with confidence. The miller thought, "This is a fine match for my daughter," and so he promised her to the man. But the young woman's heart was uneasy. Though the man smiled, there was something in his eyes she could not trust. They seemed too cold, too watchful, like a wolf who hides beneath a cloak. The suitor came often to visit. Each time he spoke kindly, but his questions were strange. He asked of her family, of the mill, of her daily tasks, and often he asked her to come to his house in the forest. "You must see where I live," he said. "It is only right that my bride should know her future home." At last, she agreed, for though she feared him, she could not refuse without raising suspicion. The man gave her a ring of gold and told her the path through the woods. "Scatter ashes and peas as you go," whispered an old woman at the mill, "for they will help you find your way home again." The maiden listened. She placed a basket on her arm and set out into the forest. The trees grew tall and dark above her. The path twisted like a ribbon through shadows. But as she walked, she scattered peas and ashes behind her, marking her way. After a long while, she reached a lonely house. Its walls were gray, its roof sagging with age, and yet a strange unease filled the air around it. Birds would not land upon its roof. No flowers grew in its garden. She stepped inside. The rooms were silent, cold, empty. On the walls hung chains. On the floor lay bones. And in the corner, a great dark oven stood, its mouth gaping wide. Her heart trembled. She whispered to herself, "This is a house of murderers." Just then, an old woman appeared. Her face was wrinkled with years, her eyes kind but sorrowful. She took the maiden's hand. "Poor child," she said softly, "you have come to a place of evil. These men mean to kill you. You must hide, and when they sleep, you must run." The maiden's breath quickened, but she did as she was told. The old woman led her behind a great barrel. There she crouched, her hands trembling, her heart beating like a drum. Not long after, she heard voices. The suitor had returned with his companions. They laughed cruelly, their boots heavy upon the floor. They carried something with them, the body of a girl. And as the maiden watched in horror, they began to cut it apart. Here we soften the tone, describing in shadows rather than detail. So the horror is distant, dreamlike. The maiden closed her eyes. She pressed her hands to her ears. But still she heard their voices. Still she felt the weight of their cruelty. At last, it grew quiet. The men had fallen into drunken sleep. The old woman crept to the barrel. "Now, child, run. The moon is high. Follow the trail you made with peas and ashes. Go quickly, and do not look back." The maiden rose. Her feet were silent upon the floor, but as she passed the table, she stumbled. Her hand struck against a finger, a severed finger, that the men had dropped. It was small and pale, and upon it gleamed a golden ring. The ring belonged to her. For a moment she froze, but then she took it up, and she fled into the forest. The path was dark, but the moonlight shone upon the trail of peas and ashes. Step by step, she followed them. Her breath was ragged, her heart swift, but she did not stop. At last she reached the mill, safe again. The next day, the wedding feast was held. The suitor arrived, dressed in fine clothes, his smile bright and false. The maiden sat quietly beside her father. The tables groaned with food. The guests laughed and sang, but her eyes were heavy with secrets. At last, she rose. Her voice was soft but steady. "I have a dream to tell," she said. The guests leaned closer. The suitor's smile stiffened. "In my dream, I walked through a dark forest. I came to a house, and there I saw chains upon the wall, and bones upon the floor. I saw cruel men, and I saw death. I hid, and I escaped. But as I fled, I carried with me a token, a finger, with a golden ring. This ring," she lifted her hand, and the finger fell upon the table. The suitor grew pale as ash. His companions cried out. The guests rose in shock. The miller's men seized the robbers, and justice was swift. The maiden was safe, and her heart was free. Here we soften once more. ... The story ending not in fear, but in relief and peace. And so ends the tale of the robber bridegroom, a tale of shadows in the forest, and the light of courage that guides us safely home. There was once a king who had 12 daughters. Each one was beautiful, graceful, and radiant as sunlight through stained glass. They were sisters in harmony, bound together by laughter and song. But the king, though he loved them dearly, carried a troubled heart. Every night he locked their door. Every morning, when he unlocked it, he found their shoes worn through. The soles were thin, The ribbons frayed, as though they had danced until dawn. And yet, the princesses never left their chamber, at least not in any way he could see. The king puzzled over it. He grew stern. At last, he proclaimed, "Whoever can discover where my daughters go at night shall choose one of them for his bride and inherit my kingdom. But if he tries and fails within 3 nights, his life shall be forfeit." Princes from far and wide came to try their luck. Each was given a place to rest, a bed in the chamber beside the princesses. Each vowed to keep watch, but when morning came, every one of them lay fast asleep, and the shoes of the sisters were once more worn through. One by one, the princes failed, and one by one, they vanished from the court. At last, a poor soldier heard of the challenge. He was weary from battle, his cloak tattered, his purse empty, but he was clever and brave, and he thought, "What have I to lose? If the first succeed, I gain a kingdom. If I fail, at least my life has meaning." On his journey to the castle, he met an old woman upon the road. Her eyes were bright with wisdom. She asked where he was bound. The soldier told her. The old woman nodded slowly. "The princesses are clever," she said. "They will give you wine to drink, but it is a potion that brings sleep. You must not drink. Pretend instead. Take this cloak. It is woven with magic. When you wear it, you will be invisible. Follow them, and you will learn their secret." The soldier thanked her, bowed low, and continued to the castle. That night he was welcomed into the chamber of the 12 princesses. They greeted him with smiles, but their eyes held mischief. They offered him a goblet of wine. He lifted it to his lips, but as he tipped it back, he let the liquid spill into the furs at his collar. Then he stretched upon the bed and lay still, breathing slowly. The princesses whispered among themselves. "He sleeps," they said. But the soldier was awake, and beneath his blanket he drew the cloak of invisibility across his shoulders. At midnight, the eldest princess clapped her hands. The bed slid aside, and from the floor rose 12 shining staircases. Each stair glowed like silver moonlight. The princesses gathered their skirts and descended one by one. The soldier rose silently. He followed close behind. The hem of the youngest sister's gown brushed against his arm, but she did not feel him. They came into a passage lined with trees. Their leaves shimmered like polished silver. The soldier plucked a branch. It rang like bells in his hand. The youngest princess shivered. "Someone is following us," she whispered. But the eldest laughed softly. "Only the wind in the trees, little one." They walked on. Soon the silver trees gave way to trees of gold. Their leaves gleamed with a deep, warm light. The soldier broke a branch, and it chimed like music. Again the youngest trembled, but the eldest hushed her. At last they passed through a grove where the leaves were diamonds. They shone with brilliance, scattering light like stars. The soldier plucked one branch and hid it in his cloak. The sisters came to a great lake. Upon the shore waited 12 boats, and 12 princes stood ready to row them across. The princesses stepped inside. The soldier leaped into the boat of the youngest and sat unseen beside her. The boat sank lower with his weight. The prince who rowed it frowned. "This vessel is heavy tonight." But the princess laughed softly. "The air is damp, that is all." They crossed the water. On the far shore stood a castle of crystal. Its windows blazed with light. From within came music, violins and horns, pipes and drums. The doors swung open. Inside was a ballroom of wonder. The walls gleamed with mirrors, the chandeliers dripped with gems, and there upon the marble floor, the 12 sisters danced. They danced with the princes who had waited. They danced with such joy that their gowns swirled like petals in the wind. The music rose high and fell soft, and still they danced. The soldier watched. He picked up a golden goblet from the table and slipped it into his cloak. He stayed until the candles burned low, and the shoes of the princesses were worn thin. Then, as dawn approached, the sisters returned. They crossed the lake, passed through the diamond grove, through the gold grove, through the silver grove, and up the shining stairs. The soldier followed unseen, and when the beds closed above them, he lay down once more, as if he had slept the whole night through. The next morning, the king called for him. "Well, soldier, did you discover where my daughters go at night?" The soldier bowed. "Yes, your majesty. They go into a secret kingdom beneath the earth. There they dance until dawn with 12 hidden princes. Here is proof." He laid before the king the silver branch, the golden branch, the diamond branch, and the golden goblet. The princesses turned pale. The eldest tried to deny it, but the king would not hear. The soldier had won, and so he chose one of the sisters to be his bride. Not the eldest, nor the youngest, but the one who had looked at him with kindness in her eyes. And when they were wed, the secret dance came to an end. Here we pause, long and quiet, the story closing like a soft lullaby. And so ends the tale of the 12 dancing princesses, a story of mystery, of silver and gold, of hidden music and secret joy.